Gatos and mores mi, dominos anderva es mi, tonos trextonos entero es mi, boamos maro es mi, brigos damneos es mi, gaesos and bodwa es mi, huerte vextu es mi, cue daños, cue devo derba mi webro elisios, cante digai, cante digate es mi.
The accusation that Catholicism contains within it elements of paganism, knowingly or unknowingly absorbed from that ancient European society, has been a long-running one. But what if I told you that the seat of the Pope himself, the very heart of the Catholic Church, is resting upon pagan foundations? Not theologically, but literally. Join me as I explore the origins of the Vatican Hill and the ancient pagan seers that gave it its name. The Vatican. The word has come to represent the very heart of the Catholic Church, its center of power. Yet the name is of pure pagan origin, going right back into the misty period before the split between Italic, Celtic, and even Germanic, a period possibly corresponding to the Bell Beaker Chalcolithic or Copper Age. The name Vatican comes from Latin Vaticanus, the name of a hill just on the northwest side of the Tiber River, across from the Campus Martius, which in ancient times lay outside of the sacred city boundaries. It's a name constructed of two elements. The first, Vates, is an ancient Italic word, meaning prophet, diviner, poet, and kanos, meaning to sing or chant. Along with this are a host of Latin words like Vaticanium, meaning a prediction or prophecy, Vaticanor, to prophesy, all from the same root. The name of the hill strongly suggests that at some point in the prehistory of Rome, Latin prophets of old dwelt on the hill, issuing prophecies from the hilltop, giving rise to its name. However, like with much of ancient Roman religion, mythology, and custom, only fragments of the true spiritual nature of the hill and the ancient prophets associated with it survive into the time of Roman literature. There was a significant break in the historical memory of the Roman people, maybe during the period of history between the fall of the kingship and the rise of the Republic, which left them with very little knowledge of their own original gods and myths, though they continued to carry out rituals to them. Perhaps a type of iconoclasm and anti-poetic movement took hold, wishing not to sully the gods with silly tales. But if so, its ultimate effect was to replace native tales with Greek ones, or to leave many gods formerly of central importance completely unknown. They also exchanged their native words, which had once denoted their prophetic poets, to the Greek-derived poeta. The ancient Italic poets were called Vates. Its earliest written use is by the poet Aeneas, who uses it in a rather derogatory way, a word to describe an old rustic, daft bard, while he considers himself a poeta, which he considered to represent a superior, educated, erudite class of people. Livy uses it likewise, speaking about the panic gripping Rome during the Second Punic War. He said, "Then little sacrificers and Vates, whose number at that time had multiplied enormously in the city, were performing sacrifices everywhere, in public and private places, by commanding the masses." Livy's use of the word Vates is derogatory, basically calling them superstitious charlatans who stir up fear. Yet it's with Cicero that we see the full spectrum of the Vates in ancient Italic society. While he occasionally uses the word in a derogatory sense, he speaks of the Vates as ancient and divinely inspired seers in a completely neutral way. And so men, clever even long ago, so that they might seem to be Vates, spoke many things in a frenzied and poetic way. And in De Oratore, he adds a little more detail to this, saying, "For a poet is born, but an orator is made. No one can be a Vates, except through a certain divine spirit. And in this respect, poets are often called Vates, because they are stirred up, as if by some divine inspiration. But the name Vates properly belongs to those who truly foresee things." What is translated here as divine inspiration, quaesi divino quodam, afflatu concitantur, more literally means as if through a certain divine breath they are stirred up. A Vates is, according to Cicero, a seer who is roused into a frenzied state by a divine breath, which we might call a possession, which grants the individual the ability to see the future. Amazingly, this association between the Vates and this frenzied state that Cicero ascribes to them shows a direct line of continuity back into the Neolithic, as the origin of the word itself, Vates, comes from Proto-Indo-European huet, meaning excited or possessed. It's cognate with Gaelic phi, from Proto-Celtic Vates, meaning a seer or prophet, Old English wod, insane, mad, Welsh gwaud, praise poetry or exaltation, Old Norse other, mind, poetry, inspiration, and ultimately linked to the divine name, Odin or Wodan. This concept is similar to that of the Greek mantis, the ancient Greek seers whose name is related to the verb maimomai, to be mad or to rage, which shows the concept of associating rage and madness to prophetic arts, to be of ancient Indo-European origin. However, the cognate use is specifically concentrated in Celtic and Germanic, showing that this specific class of poet-seer was of bell-beaker origin, as Germanic peoples are both a fusion of corded ware and bell-beaker ancestry, and were also under Celtic influences. The use developed among them in parallel. The divine name Odin, from Proto-Germanic Wodenas, meaning the furious one, appears to have been directly related to this ancient class of seer. His acquisition of knowledge, the frenzy associated with his berserk warriors, the loss of his eye, possibly even the use of his spear, is symbolic of this ancient class once common to the ancestors of the Romans, Celts, and Germans. In Gaelic, they are known as the Fai, or in Old Gaelic, the Fath. But they are likewise closely linked to the class known as the Fili, whose name comes from Proto-Celtic welitis, from the verb weleti, to see. Thus the name is just a synonym. In modern Irish, ken fa is a typical way to ask why, but it actually comes from Proto-Celtic watus, meaning divine utterance or inspiration, as opposed to the Vates, who is one who is inspired. So by Old Irish, it takes on a meaning of cause or reason, as well as prophecy. And the semantic shift is from overuse, from saying, for instance, "What prophecy has you setting out today? What prophecy has caused you to lay about? What prophecy has you studying this dead language?" Until the word prophecy simply becomes understood as cause or reason. That's how deeply embedded this type of soothsaying was in ancient Celtic society. The way that these ancient seers performed their prophecies was through song, or more like chanting. The chant that you heard at the start of this video was in Proto-Celtic, translated by myself from parts of the Song of Amergin, which is in Old Irish. Now this is why the Latin Vates referred to both poets and seers, and why also in Germanic tradition Odin is a god of poetry, and Old Norse Other means equally song, poetry, and inspiration, as well as the closely related, though perhaps not cognate, Other meaning mad, furious, and inspired. Though Germanic derived two separate words for poetic inspiration and madness from the same Indo-European root, they nevertheless remain closely connected. The separation at a certain stage leads to the confusion and double gods of Odin and Other. In Roman tradition too, this singing and poetry remained associated with the Vates, as seen in the word Vaticanor, which combines Vates with cano, to sing. So the word for prophecy in Latin straightforwardly relates to the singing Vates. And it's the same word that gives us the name Vatican. Cicero said of them in De Legibus,
But these things may well be ancient. I believe that unknown Vates have brought down to us their songs, those who compose them. For I do not suppose that men of old formed their lives only rough and joyless feasting, but also by a somewhat more refined way of life. For there exist many ancient songs in which the praises of famous men are celebrated, and I believe that these were sung by those Vates who lived in those times.
The Latin Vates, the Celtic Vates, have an identical origin. And as such, what Roman and Greek writers tell us about the Celts could be much like a window back in time to the Proto-Italic peoples, who were the closest of all other European groups to the Proto-Celts, and likely belonged to the same linguistic group before splitting off sometime in the Middle Bronze Age, forming a theoretical language stage known as Italo-Celtic. While the Italic people were later heavily influenced by the Greeks, losing much of their original folk beliefs and practices through the adoption of Greek gods, myths, and poetry, which the elite found to be more sophisticated and associated with high status, the Celts were more isolated from their external Mediterranean influences, and therefore changed much less. When Roman writers spoke about the barbarity of the Celts, they were basically looking through a portal to their own not-so-distant past. The ancient Greek historian Strabo remarked,
Among all the Gallic peoples, generally speaking, there are three sets of men who are held in exceptional honor: the bards, the Vates, and the druids. The bards are singers and poets, the Vates diviners and natural philosophers, while the druids, in addition to natural philosophy, study also moral philosophy.
Now, what he meant by natural philosophy is the study of the working of nature. The Druids' study of moral philosophy was due to their role in acting as judges. As to their forms of divination, the most extreme might have involved human sacrifice. Strabo continues.
They used to strike a human being, whom they had devoted to death, in the back with a saber, and then divine from his death struggle. But they would not sacrifice without the Druids. We are told of still other kinds of human sacrifice. For example, they would shoot victims to death with arrows, or impale them in temples, or, having devised a colossus of straw and wood, throw into the colossus cattle and wild animals of all sorts and human beings, and then make a burnt offering of the whole thing.
This suggests three different forms of sacrifice, matching in some detail the medieval commentary about Lucan's Pharsalia, many hundreds of years later, suggesting a legitimate tradition, because the details are divergent enough that it's not simply a copy. Yet he describes more benign practices as well.
But the following story, about which Artemidorus is told about the case of the crows, is still more fabulous. There is a certain harbor on the ocean coast, which is surnamed Two Crows, and in this harbor are to be seen two crows, with their right wings somewhat white. So men who have disputes about certain things come here, put a plank on an elevated place, and then throw on barley cakes, each man separately. The birds fly up, eat some of the barley cakes, scatter the others, and the man whose barley cakes are scattered wins his dispute.
Ravens and crows are frequently seen as being prophetic due to their close association with death. As the dead transit to the realm of the spirits, and as the ravens consume the dead and fly up into the heavens, the ravens are in close connection with the spirits and can potentially express something from the other side. The custom is actually not so far removed from one known in Italy. The Iguina tables preserve some details about Italic augury. It says,
below a certain boundary line, the augur must see and hear the call of a parfa and a crow above that line. He must see and hear a woodpecker and a magpie.
Now the woodpecker was one of the primary birds of divination. Picus, the name of the woodpecker, was the son of Mars, though some other traditions make him a son of Saturn instead. But either way, the woodpecker was a sacred bird of Mars, and though frequently overlooked for the more famous she-wolf, the bird would help raise the twins who founded Rome. According to Strabo, the Italic tribe of the Picantes derived their name from the woodpecker, due to a ritual vow to Mars of the youth who were sent out to form new communities. They followed the woodpecker and took its name. Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote of a custom nearby.
A very ancient oracle of Mars, similar to that of Dodona. Only there a pigeon was said to prophesy, sitting on an oak, whereas here a woodpecker, sitting on a wooden pillar, was believed to speak oracles.
While it was anciently suggested that the woodpecker is sacred to Mars due to its aggressive pecking, it may have more to do with its relation to the tree. Among the Celts, trees are closely associated with knowledge, and perhaps the bird's pecking at the tree could be seen as bringing it into close association with the tree's secrets, though this is only one alternative theory. Diodorus Siculus, writing in Greek, tells of the Celts.
The Gauls likewise make use of diviners, accounting them worthy of high approbation, and these men foretell the future by means of the flight or cry of birds, and of the slaughter of sacred animals, and they have all multitudes subservient to them. They also observe a custom which is especially astonishing and incredible. In case they are taking thought with respect to matters of great concern, for in such cases they devote a man to death, and plunge a dagger into him in the region above the diaphragm, and when the stricken victim has fallen, they read the future from the manner of his fall, from the twitching of his limbs, as well as from the gushing of the blood, having learned to place confidence in an ancient and long-continued practice of observing such matters.
Now the Greek word that Diodorus uses to describe these diviners is mantis, from manomai, to be mad or raging, as I mentioned earlier. And though from a different root, it's very interesting that the Greek word for the same type of person conveys exactly the same meaning as in Latin and Celtic Vates. Now, a commonly overlooked feature of this early cult of Mars is that he was associated with prophecies and auguries specifically. He was a god of royal order, the father of the founder of the city, and to whom the king and later the Rex Sacrorum maintained a shrine to within their official abode, along with a sacred spear which would shake if war was approaching. Yet he was also a wild, untamed god, a god whom the young and the vagrants were dedicated to, and when they were cast out of the city to make way on their own in the wild, much as Romulus and his band had been. And it may be significant that the Vatican Hill is directly across the Tiber from the Campus Martius. Now, unfortunately, the earliest we hear of the hill itself is in the writings of Varro in the 1st century BC, in a now lost book called the Divine Antiquities. Luckily, however, the later Aulus Gellius, an antiquarian of the 2nd century AD, remarked that Varro claimed that the hill was linked to a god called Vagitanos, He linked a site to the word for a baby's cry and the ability of speech believed to be derived from the god, which also lent its name to the word for a prophet. Varro was certainly wrong about the details of this god, most of which he probably invented based on the incorrect folk etymology. Gellius himself provides far greater insight when he states in contrast,
"We have been told that the word Vatican is applied to the hill, and the deity who presides over it, from the Vaticania, or prophecies, which took place there by the power and inspiration of the god."
The Vatican Hill was always known as such, as early as we know, but anciently the Janiculum Hill was also sometimes called the Vatican. The flat area between the two hills was called the Campus Vaticanus, or the Ager Vaticanus. Nero built a circus there, the remains of which lay within what is now the Vatican City. Yet nothing that happened in the later history of the place really gives us much clue as to its earlier use. The few comments by Varro and Gellius are about all we hear. Yet the name alone is enough for us to delve into its deeper mysteries. The Vates were the ancient seers, and likely there was in much earlier times an organized group of them who dwelt on the hill and were sought out for their divination and prophecies. Now legend states that it was on the Vatican Hill that the first Christian community of Rome was established, and that beneath its 15th century basilica is the grave site of St. Peter himself, and a tomb which is located directly below the high altar. Now some claim that St. Peter was never even in Rome, let alone the first bishop there. Yet a tradition that Peter and Paul were in Rome is first attested by Ignatius of Antioch, and then Irenaeus of Lyons, who said that Peter and Paul had founded a church in Rome. The first claim that Peter had died there is found in Eusebius, a historian and Christian bishop, writing in the early 4th century. He said,
"It is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified under Nero. This account of Peter and Paul is substantiated by the fact that their names are preserved in the cemeteries of that place even to the present day. It's confirmed likewise by Caius, a member of the church, who arose under Zephyrinus, bishop of Rome. He, in a published disputation with Proculus, the leader of the Phrygian heresy, speaks as follows concerning the place where the sacred corpses of the aforesaid apostles are laid. For if you will go to the Vatican or to the Ostian Way, you will find the trophies of those who laid the foundations of this church."
Now his comments seem to reflect a debate that was going on within the church, even in the early 4th century, about the truth of whether Peter and Paul really died in Rome. Now I think there is a strong historical case for this, based on the amount of early sources that we have placing them in Rome, starting in the 2nd century. Now if they were there, they would have been there in the early to mid-60s, during the rule of the mad emperor Nero. In the year 64, a fire ravaged Rome. The public, furious, began to turn their hatred toward the emperor, and Nero looked about for a scapegoat. The Christian community was at that time a small and hated minority. Tacitus, a contemporary pagan writer of the Roman elite, reported the events, and it's clear he disliked the Christians. Yet even so, he was shocked and disgusted about what happened. Nero had built a circus on the Ager Vaticanus, which was referred to as his garden. Rounding up hundreds who confessed to be Christians, they were brought to the gardens and sentenced to death. Some were crucified, some were burned like human torches, others were torn to pieces by animals. All the executions were public display, intended by Nero for amusement. But even the populace that hated the Christians found their murder in such ways and numbers to be unreasonably cruel. If St. Peter was martyred in Rome, it was in this great slaughter initiated by Nero. At that time, Christians were such an insignificant group that Tacitus would not have bothered to mention Peter. He mentions no Christian by name at all, even Jesus, though he does seem to make reference to his execution in Judea. They were known for being a small and annoying cult, not for any great spiritual revelations. This mass murder by Nero was the first of the great martyrdoms of Christianity. Even if Peter had not been among them, it makes Rome the logical location for the head of the church, aside from the practical importance of the city. Nero had built the circus there because it was one of the few places still undeveloped in Rome. There was an extensive necropolis there dating to the imperial period, but likely the practice of burying the dead there well predates this. There's often a very close connection between making prophecies and the dead, because ultimately the prophecies are thought to come from the realm of the dead. When Constantine converted in order to be absolved from the sin of murdering his son, he decided to build a basilica dedicated to Peter on the Vatican, which evolved into a pilgrimage site, and then the seat of the Pope. Yet, if we believe in the will of God, or the gods, then this entire chain of causality is in fact the unfolding of divine will. Now, perhaps more than 2,800 years after the hill was first named for the pagan seers who inhabited it, their name is world-renowned and synonymous with the leadership of the Catholic Church, preserving in some form the memory of these ancient pagan seers and their beliefs. Now, you know me, you can check back through all of my many videos. I approach things as a hard-nosed realist. That includes mythology. But is it really a coincidence that this ancient hill named for these ancient Italic seers becomes the center of the Catholic Church and synonymous with the Church itself, which becomes known as the Holy See? Now, the Holy See actually comes from Latin sedes, means holy seat, but it's a very big coincidence that a hill named for ancient seers becomes known as the Holy See. The Vatican is, however, only one of the more visible examples of this process. Many churches were built on former pagan ritual sites, and many saints are Christianized pagan gods. But even the Christian conception of God, especially his Trinitarian nature, is highly influenced by European pagan thought. But these topics are things that I will have to take up in another video. Well, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. And consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, through YouTube Super Stickers, or become a member of the channel, which will give you access to content that is only available to members, and you will get to see content ad-free. Thank you all for your support, and as always, stand tall.